So clearly this is an issue that has been around for a while. As you were showing sort of an overview of the existing guidance, we've spent a lot of time sort of digging back into what our existing guidance is. I mean, the corporate standard makes that same reference about using supplier-specific emission factors. And it also gives a case study of renewable energy certificates in the US, which I'll be getting to later. So there is this precedent that we have for supporting these mechanisms as a valid instrument for GHG inventory. But I think since the time that was published, a lot more complexity has been introduced into the conversation, both from the accuracy of the accounting, sort of these questions about double counting within Scope 2 users, but also I think these broader policy questions about the appropriateness of these mechanisms, how effective they are at actually driving change, and what the expectations of users are when they're reading a report that says, I have 0 emissions associated with my electricity consumption. You know, sort of what that means in the minds of consumers, and then what the instruments are really designed to do. So this is something we've started looking at over the last year or so. And so today I'm hoping to talk to you a little bit about how companies are purchasing renewable energy. We've talked a little bit about some of the instruments, but I'll go through the 3 main categories that we've identified. And then also talk a little bit about just what the accounting actually looks like. We talked today sort of about thinking of these purchases in terms of an emission factor. In the US, there was also a precedent of using some of these instruments to take a different methodological approach, thinking about avoided emissions, so sort of more of an approach you would take for offset accounting, which introduced a host of other complexities and tensions. So talk a little bit about where the accounting, sort of what it looks like, and where these purchases end up in an inventory. Talk about some of the challenges, and then how we are trying to go about addressing these issues to provide clarifying guidance. So I just want to start with this equation that companies are faced with when they're thinking about Scope 2. They're thinking about the consumption of electricity multiplied right now. Sort of the default practice that we have in our tools is an emission factor of consumed or purchased electricity. Consumed would be a grid average of a physical emission factor based in a defined boundary. And I specify here, for Scope 2, we're talking about generation only, so not the full life cycle. The full life cycle would be reflected in Scope 3. So that's the basic framework equation. If you're thinking about ways to reduce Scope 2, you would probably start first with consumption. How can I improve efficiency, conservation, sort of bring that number down? And then also installing renewable energy on site will actually also reduce the consumption that you're listing in Scope 2, because Scope 2 is designed just for grid-consumed electricity. So more on site, less from the grid, you can bring the consumption number down. But when you're thinking about what an emission factor represents, if that's part of your sort of Scope 2 strategy, the difficulty, I think, for companies is that this is an indirect category. This factor can change due to no personal effort of the consumers, either in a good way or in a bad way. You can be in a grid environment where they're adding new coal-fired power plants, in which case that number, is looking worse from a GHG point of view. Or you might be in a grid where the feed-in tariff is very strong, there's new incentives, so other people are sort of taking actions that indirectly benefit you in this equation. So that's just sort of inherent in if we're using grid average numbers. There is also the sense that if you do large-scale efficiency or on-site renewables, that could sort of impact total demand on the system depending on the scale of who the inventory company is. But again, there's sort of the indirect quality to that. But I think it sort of comes back to the sense of can you change the GHG intensity of the product you're consuming? If you're thinking about renewable energy as a product, and thinking not necessarily in terms of consumed, which is dictated by the grid on a physical basis, but thinking on a sort of contractual layer, thinking can I change that sort of purchase profile, even if I can't control sort of what's coming through my socket. At least if I could change the purchase profile, that would potentially have a change on the whole grid, and that this could sort of improve the equation. I also wanted to bring in that if you've sort of exhausted those 2 components, the common practice for many companies is also to purchase and apply an offset credit that could be appropriate for any scope or sort of total emissions. There's a lot of questions and controversy about how effective that is as a mitigation strategy, but just to sort of place that, sort of the offset purchase would go at the end once you've done the full equation as a sort of net claim or reduction. So in terms of the type, sort of the three main types of purchasing mechanisms that we've found in our scoping process has been power purchase agreements. So these are, I mean, this is, I guess, a more specific example, but it fits into this larger group of contracts. So a contract between consumer and a generator for a specific amount of electricity from a specified generation source. There's also, I think, there's a change. You can either change suppliers in certain markets. So you go with a supplier that has a less GHG intensive profile if they are able to disclose that information. And that would change sort of, from year 1 to year 2. If you choose a less intensive supplier for their whole portfolio, that could be recorded there. But also within suppliers' portfolios, they may have differentiated products or a label. So for instance, OK Power, Wind Source, Nature Made, some of these are, a specific label with specific criteria about what types of energy are included. So that's all, located in the supplier, at the supplier level. And then there's this final category of tracking instruments that reflect environmental benefits of low carbon energy production. These, I think the main reference that we have in the US is renewable energy certificates, which I'll get to in a moment. But essentially, these were designed as sort of an innovative, in the US, it's designed as an innovative market mechanism to be, in fact, decoupled from the underlying electricity flows. So whereas, the power purchase agreement is really about power delivery, the tracking instruments are designed to give you more flexibility so that you can be in a location where you might not be able to make an agreement with a renewable energy producer, you might not be able to change to a renewable energy supplier, but if you can purchase one of these tracking instruments, that could, in fact, sort of carry the claim about zero emissions energy to you so that you can make that, part of your renewable energy goal or potentially part of the Scope 2 reduction goal. This, I think, is maybe the most contentious or problematic that we've found in our scoping process. And I want to just sort of touch on, again, renewable energy certificates in the US. There aren't too many folks from the US here, but when we've had scoping conversations in the US, this becomes extremely contentious, I think. The purposes for renewable energy certificates are both, they're twofold. One is that a single renewable energy certificate can be used for regulatory quota tracking, so individual states within the US, the suppliers may have an obligation to source 10, 15, 20% of their electricity from renewable sources. And so they would use this tracking instrument to demonstrate, yes, I have sourced, I've purchased or acquired this certificate from renewable energy generation source, and I submit these to the program administrator to show I've met my obligation. But in addition to, or sort of separately from, I guess, that usage, there's also a voluntary usage. So a single renewable energy certificate can either be used for a regulatory purpose, or if there's no regulatory need, companies or suppliers can purchase these either for validation to say, yes, we have a renewable energy portfolio, or again, if it's sort of decoupled for a company, to be able to say, I've acquired the attributes of that energy. So zero emissions profile, other environmental benefits, those are all sort of in my possession now that I have this certificate. And I think this, especially on the voluntary side, this was really envisioned as a revenue stream for developers to say, renewable energy might be facing all these other obstacles and barriers, but at least if you can get a little bit of revenue from selling the benefits, that would make it more attractive, I think more attractive to purchase. We have a primary certifier in the US called Green E, and they have specific eligibility criteria for voluntary uses that they've described as meeting consumer demand. So they will only certify energy that was built after a certain date, and energy that I think fits for hydropower and some other biomass sources. They have some specific criteria to try and create a more sustainable profile of the energy. So it's not not all renewable energy is eligible to be certified for that purpose. There's also tracking systems in place so that once a REC is created, it's clear sort of its path. It's created, might be used by a supplier or an end user, in which case it's retired, and a clear audit trail is present. There's also the advantage, I think, in the US is that there's a government recognition program for companies that are purchasing renewable energy, and it's recommended to be certified by Greenie, and that's with our government, the EPA, and it's called the Green Power Partnership. So many of our biggest companies in the US are part of that, are being recognized for buying green power, and specifically it's phrased around reducing carbon emissions. Thinking about guarantees of origin in the EU, I won't spend too much time on this since I know we'll be touching on it a little bit later, but I think my understanding is, in contrast to the US, this tracking instrument was born out of supplier fuel disclosure requirements, so it maybe was not originally envisioned in the same sort of voluntary market mechanism sense that RECs in the US were, and the goal was really just for accurate tracking. But individual countries have implemented this system differently, so some of them, at least in my research, are clearly defined with carbon attributes, and some of them it's not obvious or it's ambiguous in the legislative language. And I think our workshops that we've held here have indicated that there is sort of varying popularity about using these in a decoupled way for corporate claims because of a lot of the related policy issues that I'll get into next. But in terms of what the accounting actually looks like, I just want to go through a quick exercise sort of visually that sometimes helps me really think through this. So basically we have each of these bubbles representing a megawatt hour of generation and emissions associated with that megawatt hour. And for those generators, that constitutes scope 1. The black boxes on the right are consumers who are trying to reflect the energy purchases or consumption of that energy in their scope 2. So if we do a grid average emission factor, we say, here's total system emissions, here's total system energy output. The average emission factor is sort of, numerator divided by denominator, and that leaves sort of all of the users with, assuming their energy consumption here is equal, which I've done for these purposes, with essentially the same profile. So it's consumption-based. Everyone takes account for the sort of average mix of what's coming through their system. Now, if we think about using a supplier-specific emission factor, again, is sort of thinking about the larger purpose of allocating these generation emissions to end consumers. Then we have something that looks a little more like this, where you have, say, supplier 1 that encompasses either through owned generation assets or through purchased energy, sort of taking responsibility for that portfolio. And there you have a different sort of total emission set, different energy output. This looks very high on renewables. And so you have a much lower average coming out of this supplier. But the second supplier has a much higher average. They maybe have not done investments in renewables, haven't prioritized that. So depending on the supplier that is chosen, it's either much lower, 5, or much, much higher. So depending on the sort of supplier mix, that can produce something different. And then finally, thinking about using a tracking instrument or other contractual mechanism to do that same allocation process. Here we're thinking about all the generation emissions, and 2 of them sort of are isolated or captured in a tracking instrument and claimed uniquely by a single user. So for that single user, that product means the total production emissions are 0. Total output is megawatt hours. So the emission factor there is 0 for production. But then the adjusted grid average for the remaining generation ends up being 5.6. So what that looks like is then everyone else on the grid uses this adjusted number, and a single company has 0. So this is all sort of, this, but I guess to me the interesting thing at the very end, I'm going to scoot ahead, is that company 1's, their performance calculating scope 2 with 3 different emission factors either looks not so great, okay, if they chose a better supplier, or totally awesome. So it could be difficult, I think, for an outside someone evaluating the inventory from the outside to really understand the difference between what you've purchased versus what you're actually consuming and where the real responsibility lies. In terms of what this actually looks like, I think the two reporting formats that have come up in our discussions have either been as an alternative emission factor, sort of taking place in a gross calculation. So here you might document total amount of consumption, total amount of renewable energy certificates or other similar mechanism that are purchased, and then come up with a sort of adjusted consumption to say if you only bought renewable energy to cover half of your consumption, then you end up calculating the other half using grid average. And so that you have a lower total scope 2 than you would if you hadn't bought any renewable energy. But then there's also a thought of putting this in a sort of more net adjustment like you would an offset or other external purchase, where you still calculate scope 2 based on grid average, but you're able to demonstrate a sort of second profile as an adjustment, and so that when you're doing a net description of, here's my gross emissions, but I've bought offsets, I've bought green power, here's the adjusted profile. That's been another format that's been recommended, or that's come up as a practice. So I think the accounting instruments, we've broken it down into three sort of big challenges. One, could a company theoretically use this? So that's talking about, is this instrument designed to carry this information, to be used in this way, to carry information about emission rates? Does it contain those attributes? Is it clear that those attributes are there, or was the instrument designed for a totally different purpose and companies are trying to make a claim around it? This is especially true in highly regulated areas where there might be multiple tracking certificates that are serving different purposes. This is just to say, is it designed to carry this kind of claim? So if it is, does the information source function as an emission factor that's accurate and doesn't have double counting across scope 2 users? So that goes to the issue we talked about of ensuring unique ownership sort of through a tracking and a registry, a serial number, clear retirement, but also adjusting a grid average so that two users are not sort of claiming the same thing. But then we get to the trickier question of should this be used, which for us is more uncomfortable territory since we are a policy neutral organization, and we have a set of principles that I'll be pointing to in a moment. But there's also very diverse stakeholder views, determining the parameters, I guess, for evaluating, is this instrument appropriate for inventory disclosure? It might be appropriate for supporting renewable energy. It might be appropriate for energy labeling, but does all of that translate into GHG inventories? And for that, I think the 5 principles that the GHG protocol has, we've been trying to think through, sort of these information sources to say, do they contribute to an inventory that's accurate? Which would be us saying contractual allocation is as accurate or more accurate than grid average physical-based emission factors. Is it consistent? If we've been trying to think about the logic between how we do scope 2, how we do scope 3, product inventories, sort of the information sources that are repeated and sent downstream. There needs to be consistency between that. So if we have established practices for how this would appear in a life cycle product inventory, should that also be consistent with how a corporate inventory would look? We have to think about, is this complete? Does this give a complete picture of corporate performance using this source of information? Is it transparent? Is it clear to outside stakeholders what these instruments mean? Or are you hiding real risks in the energy supply chain by not thinking about the consumption of where your consumption is actually taking place, and especially if you're already paying for standard energy and then also paying for green energy on top of that. And I think in terms of relevance, is this a meaningful reflection of a company's action and performance? So just very quickly, sort of the big level risks that we've identified are that fundamentally the dynamics of market sort of supply and demand determine whether these purchasing tools achieve the goal of supporting and driving renewable energy development, or whether they, in fact, at the end of the day, end up being a sort of shuffling of existing emission profiles amongst different users. There's concern in the U.S. that that's the case, in that you might have energy from a plant that was produced or that was constructed in 2000, which is still within our eligibility boundaries. You're buying the output or the environmental benefits from a plant in 2000. Are you helping drive new development at that point? Or are you just claiming something that's existing and hasn't really contributed to this larger goal? That's the concern, the sort of risk of paper shuffling. There's also, stakeholders have brought up concern about deprioritizing other actions, that if you're able to buy renewable energy very cheaply, you might not be incentivized to do more energy efficiency, the more expensive retrofits that you would otherwise be prioritizing looking at the Scope 2 equation. The question of fairness, of public subsidy, who really should claim this. We're talking about a public good. Emissions are sort of this public good, and we're choosing a subset of them to privatize for company claims. Anytime you're talking about something to privatize, you're running into the questions of, is this fair to the public? Is this the right incentive? Privatizing does sort of create an incentive that you wouldn't have just looking at grid average, but there are these sort of larger questions. There's also still confusion with offsets in the US. These are not offsets, but they're often conceived as them, and so they're bringing in methodology and analysis, and that's been very tricky to get through. And also contentious decisions about what counts or it's eligible. There's a lot of pushback that WRI should not be the organization that determines what's eligible, what's in, what's out, that it's really up to country-specific markets and certifying organizations to make that call. But at the same time, there's concern that if we don't say anything, then anything goes. Companies could claim energy that was created in 1980 that they feel is not really contributing to buying green energy, moving the market, but it would be okay in the WRI standard. And I won't get into too much additionality unless people have questions about that, but there's some ways that different programs have thought through additionality and thought through what does that mean, how can we test that, how can we sort of shrink the pool of existing energy to sort of fit a closer profile of what we would want to drive a new set of generation. So I'll only speak to that if there's questions, but essentially we have a pretty broad stakeholder group, but it's still open, it's still very sort of fluid and in development. So if you're interested in reading some of our current discussion drafts, weighing in, giving us some insights, all of our processes are open and welcoming. And so I would very much welcome your feedback and participation if you're able to do so. So, and I can talk more about our current draft structure if need be. So, thanks.